subscribe.
Oh, great. That's fine. Okay, so I'm here to talk to you about the critique. You've heard a little bit about the topic so far. You've heard about counterplans. You've heard about disadvantages. Almost all of these arguments rely on a notion of opportunity cost, which is if I do one thing, there's some other thing that I cannot do. If you've ever asked yourself, why is it that this is how we teach debate? It's because that's kind of the way that logic and argument has been taught for thousands of years. The critique is a set of arguments that exist outside of that paradigm, but also within it. It teaches us to question the very fundamental sets of beliefs that we have about each other, about the world, about arguments, and about logic. I always begin this lecture with a quote from a philosopher named Bruno Latour, which is, wars, so many wars, wars outside and wars inside, cultural wars, science wars, and wars against terrorism, wars against poverty and wars against the poor, against ignorance, out of ignorance. My question is simple. Should we be at war too, we, the scholars, the intellectuals? Is it really our duty to add fresh ruins to fields of ruins? Is it really the task of humanities to add deconstruction to destruction, more iconoclasm to iconoclasm? What has become of the critical spirit? Has it run out of steam? The kind of essence of this is there's this kind of feeling, I think, that a lot of us might have, which is this notion that we are bombarded constantly by information that makes us sad. Does anyone feel this? Has anyone done like doom scrolling, for example? Have you ever like opened up your social media feed and everything seems terrible? Like your friends are posting about stuff that's sad, but then there's like stuff happening in parts of the world that you've never visited before, and you're constantly being told that you should care about all of these things. Does anyone feel like they wake up some days and are just like, I can't keep caring about all of these random events that I don't know anything about? Yeah, right? Okay, so Bruno Latour's kind of fundamental question that he's posing here is, if it is the case that most of human history, in fact, most of human history that we seem to care about, I don't think it's most of human history, I just think it's most of history that is written about, because it is what gets talked about, it's what's considered exciting, is really painful. And so he's asking us fundamentally, ought we bring that into our classrooms and into our academic spaces? Should we start every affirmative speech with a description of all the ways that the world is going to fall apart, and then the negative stands up and presents all of the ways the world will fall apart in some other way? And he's kind of asking us, like, what is the point to this exercise, this dialogue, this argumentative structure of thesis, the world is going to end unless we do this, and this antithesis, if we do that, the world will end. And then the resolution is just who is more likely, who is more persuasive that the world's ending. Does this kind of structure feel like what you've been taught the past week? Yeah, right? Yeah, and it's like kind of sad where, like, no matter where you turn, whether it's debate or something else, it's just apocalypticism on repeat. So a big part of the critique is asking ourselves, is there a better way of doing things? Like, is there another world that is possible, and how can we imagine ourselves being in that different world? Okay, so I put this together a couple years ago. Harry Potter's not popular anymore, but that's okay. I think Star Wars now is popular again, so it's fine. These are a series of characters who posed a set of questions in various films that they were in that are about the critique. Yoda, always asking about plans. So the plan, the focus of the debate for the past week. The thesis of my next 2 hours is that focusing on individual ideas for how to fix the world leads to fear, because we're always afraid of what will happen if we don't do the plan. And we all know that fear leads to hate, and that hate leads to suffering. And so if you read a plan, you lose. Hold on. Okay. So what is a critique? There's a lot of different ways of thinking about it. The most common probably is that it's a counterplan plus a disadvantage. People who don't like decay will call it a counterplan with a DA that has no uniqueness. So its basic structure will be very familiar to you in the sense that it identifies a thing about the affirmative that is bad, and then it identifies some sort of solution to it. So in the starter pack so far, we've got a counter plan to do the plan via the courts, and we've got a problem with the AF that it trades off with the Farm Bill. And you'll notice that counter plans and disadvantage always involve this logic of trade-offs. If we do A, we cannot do B, and in order to make sure that we can avoid B while accomplishing some portion of A, we need to combine it with a counter plan. So that's one way of thinking about a critiques, and it's not wrong, but it's also wrong. The other thing is that it's something kind of unrelated to this, that it's about challenging the philosophical assumptions, the ethics, or the rhetorical choices behind your opponent's affirmative. So in the context of the starter pack AF, there's a bunch of assumptions that the starter pack makes about the world. For example, it makes some pretty fundamental ones that there is something unique and special about human creativity and human intelligence. It presumes that maximizing creativity, that making sure that human beings thrive as the most important species is fundamentally what is important. It makes a series of assumptions that we ought to avoid wars at all costs. It makes a series of assumptions about the legal system and Congress, and that the federal government is a trustworthy agent for solving problems. It makes a bunch of assumptions about what intelligence means. So, it's about general artificial intelligence. It has a bunch of ideas about that. It makes a bunch of assumptions about ownership and what it means to own a thing that is ephemeral or own a thing even that is material. It makes assumptions about what compensation should go into compensating for labor. And all of these are kind of baked in and unchallenged and assumed. So if you stood up and were like, the plan trades off with the Farm Bill, also the AF's notion of human creativity isn't substantiated by anything, bonobo chimpanzees also creative, that'd be kind of a strange combination. And in all of these debates that you've had so far, you're kind of taught to ignore all of those baked-in assumptions and just presume that the set of truths that the AF has presented are important. And that the thing we should be asking ourselves is how do we maximize the achievement of those truths rather than what is truth itself or what is the point of maximizing truth. And I think that difference is where the critique comes into play. Does anyone have questions so far?
Hey David, while you're paused,
Yeah.
did the missing people come?
I saw Sierra walk in. I saw Kiara walk in. I saw Vihan walk in.
Okay, nice.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. So before going into the specifics of critiques, I want to introduce this word. Anyone come across this word before? A couple of people? Okay. Does anyone want to define epistemology with an example? I know I've got definitions on here, but what are some examples? Yeah.
Thinking capitalism is good.
Thinking capitalism is good. Okay, why is that an epistemology?
Because it's something that we already think about, or that we know about, but we aren't really thinking or challenging that idea.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sure, that makes sense. Yeah, so capitalism could be an epistemology because capitalism is a way of knowing the world. I think that it would be approximately correct to say that capitalism's epistemology is one that believes the essence and importance of life is about maximizing utility, so making sure that we are as productive as possible and make sure that resources are used as efficiently as possible in order to maximize human productivity and to make sure that every hour that we work, that hour is maximized and used to its full potential. Those are a few of the assumptions kind of baked into capital. I think that makes sense. Yeah, Keats.
Historiography is part of epistemology, because it's studying history and how we know what we do now.
Yeah, okay. So an epistemology could be we look at history as the determination for how things will occur in the future. Anyone do this all the time in school? Yeah? I'm sure, yeah. Uh-huh.
I sometimes do this in school, like, very recent history outside.
yeah, definitely, right? So like all the time in history classes, you probably have a teacher who's like, this happened, and then this set of conditions occurred again, and history repeated itself, right? Like the notion that history repeats itself, we ought to pay attention to history is an epistemology, it's a way of knowing things, yeah.
Maybe the way that we would rate debates, like probably not et cetera, is how we know who wins or loses or what's important in the debate.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the idea of consequentialism, the way we should come to know things is we ask ourselves, what would be the effects of an action be? What would the effects of not doing that action? And that's how we determine whether or not we should take that action. It's just purely based on the effects of it, right? There's one like really big one that all of you are taught from a young age is the correct, proper way of encountering the world. Some of you probably made a poster board with various, huh? What?
The scientific method?
Yeah, the scientific method, right? So for the last bit, the dominant epistemology in most of the world, certainly in most Western countries or all Western countries, is the scientific method. The idea that we should use empiricism, so we should, try to create experiments that are repeatable. We pose a hypothesis. We say if X, then Y. We design a repeatable experiment to determine whether the hypothesis is true or false, and then, we do the experiment, and then we determine whether the hypothesis is true, or when you get to more advanced science, you reject your null hypothesis on the basis of that repeatable and testable experiment. And it kind of goes almost without question that science is the correct way of approaching the world. And interestingly, in the past couple of years, people fundamentally questioning science has been a real challenge for a lot of the media to cover and for a lot of people to deal with. Can anyone think of a couple of ways that people have challenged scientific beliefs and people have failed to be able to articulate why they should believe in that other than saying that's science? Like, anyone ever hear a conversation where someone says a thing, another person says, I don't think that's right, and the first person is like, well, it's science. All right, what's an example of this? Yeah.
The Earth is round.
Yeah, the Earth is round. Okay, yeah, that's one. Yeah.
Evolution.
Evolution is another good one. Yeah.
Climate change.
Climate change.
Birds are real.
Birds are real. Yeah, for sure. Also, like vaccines was the one I was thinking of, like vaccines and masks. And if we don't learn the tools of critique, right? So like, I don't really care if you ever read a critique. It doesn't matter to me. You can or you can't. There are many debaters who've been successful never reading it. There are many debaters who've been successful only reading it. But I do think it's almost indisputable that if all we learn how to do is explain why we're right under a given set of assumptions, we never acquire the skill set or the knowledge necessary to explain to someone who is challenging the fundamental premise behind our beliefs why our beliefs are true. So we're very good at telling people that climate change is happening. We're a little less good at telling people who are skeptical of science why they should believe in science. And that's kind of a thing that critiques force you to be thinking about, because they're often questions of epistemology. Yeah, so here's another quote from an old movie. Has anyone seen this movie? A couple people? Yeah, so there's this movie called The Matrix. It came out in like 2000. This character is Morpheus. His whole thing is he just says like esoteric stuff that's referencing dead Frenchmen who wrote a bunch of stuff down on paper and published it. And I mean, it's kind of asking fundamentally like what is reality and what is the difference between the reality that is, right? The world that is apparent to us versus the world that actually is. And how can, for example, two people witness something happening and take completely different ideas about what exactly happened. Something as simple as like if you're watching a sport and there's like a really close foul call in like the NBA playoffs, and a Celtics fan and a Mavericks fan will see the same play and see completely different things. Has anyone had this experience with someone? Yeah, so like every single day of our lives, we are constantly witnessing phenomena with someone sitting next to us seeing the exact same thing, and based on our set of assumptions that goes into who we are, we end up completely disagreeing on what we just saw. It happens every day, all the time. Yeah?
Do you ever know any card first proposed this?
Huh?
You know our card, the dead Frenchman you were talking about?
Well, so are you referencing the like evil demon who just created the world idea, or are you referencing some other Descartesian thing?
Like, how do you define real thing? Like,
Say more about it. Say more about it. I'm very interested in
Well,
this.
what he said was, how do we know we're not just somewhere in a room where how do we know our brain is just somewhere in a room and like our entire life is just like a dream and everything we're experiencing is completely like the same. Like our body and our brain can be fundamentally separated. It's actually kind of controversial now because it's like people are challenging it now, but it's very popular.
Yeah, so what Monty is referencing is a thought experiment that imagines that would there be a difference in your life if the world around you was real, or if your brain was just in a box somewhere in storage in a vault, and imagery and senses were just kind of fed to you? How would you know the difference between those things? Okay. All right, parts of a critique. Now it's like actual debate stuff. So just like every other argument, critique has three parts. It has uniqueness, it has link, it has impact. Can someone define uniqueness, link, impact? Yeah.
Uniqueness is that what's going on with that.
All right, yeah, uniqueness is what's going on now, what's happening. So first, you got to figure out what's going on. Then you got to figure out what's the link. Yeah.
It's the transition between what is happening now and what could happen.
Right. And that's generally what a link is. Although critiques are pretty much all about that component right here. So critiques are always asked, what are these three things, and how can we think about them differently? But yeah, so link is change that occurs as a result of the plan, is how we generally think of link arguments, although the thesis of this next 2 hours will be that is not actually what a link argument is. That's totally wrong, and everything you've been taught the past week's been a lie. Yeah?
For case, isn't the link like whether or not the app actually does follow certain epistemology?
That could be your link. Yeah. What were you gonna say?
I was going to say the impact is what is caused.
Yeah, so again, very interesting that notice how I started this lecture by saying the way that we think about debate is through opportunity cause and cause and effect logics. And when I ask you what a link is and what an impact is, you say thing that the plan causes and then effect of that cause. So we'll kind of circle back to this. All right, so just like you all said, this is what a link is, right? A link establishes an opportunity cost to the plan, i.e. the loss of potential gain from other alternatives when one alternative is chosen. Right? So when you vote affirmative, you are saying of the options that I'm presented, the one that is best is the plan. The way that I know that is because I compared the plan to those other options. So that is opportunity cost. Critiques are really different, because they let us question what we mean when we say plan, and they question what it means for something to be an opportunity cost. So the plan in a normal debate, in a typical debate, I should say, is the action that the affirmative has asked a judge to endorse. It's the action that the affirmative has asked the judge to endorse. For a lot of critiques, that's not very satisfying. The 1AC is 8 minutes of evidence compiled from scholarly resources or blogs or Twitter screenshots or whatever from all these different places The plan text takes you about 15 seconds to read, maybe 20 seconds to read if you've got a really long one. And it's a little unsatisfying to say that the sole question of the debate is whether that 15 seconds is good or bad. And so critiques want to expand the scope of competition and expand the scope of things that the negative can disagree with. So rather than just disagree with the plan, you might want to disagree with their justifications. Right? So what is a justification in the starter packet? What is an example of one? What is a reason to vote affirmative that the starter packet says you should vote out for? Yeah.
AI kills human creativity.
Yeah. So AI harms human creativity. So a link about the justification might be questioning what we mean when we say creativity. Right? Should we in fact be pursuing the maximization of creativity? What assumptions does that say about humans? So I kind of said this earlier, but it kind of has this baked-in notion that humans are different and special and important. Who can think of a potential problem with the notion that human beings are special and unique and that they have intelligence that is different from other species? Whereas, someone who hasn't talked before, where has this logic been applied in the past in ways that have been unfortunate, to say the least? Yeah, say more.
What?
Say, whoever said slavery, say more about that.
Like slavery, it was based around the characterization, or at least American slavery, or Western slavery, is based around the characterization of African Americans as less than white people, and they have to be like fixed or Christianized or whatever the belief was.
Yeah, I mean, just like for a lot of human history, including today, there's this whole notion of what it means to be a human being defined across racial lines or gendered lines or lines of class or ability. And so a lot of violence that has been done has been justified via the idea that some people are not in fact humans. They don't count as humans. Like literally in America, African Americans, black people in America counted as 3/5 of the vote for a really long time. Less than that for a really long time. And so that is kind of a way that you could make a justifications-based critique of the creativity advantage. So another is representations. So those are like the word choices that are used, the way that we phrase the 1AC. So there might be portions of the affirmative that label another country as a threat. So has anyone had a debate where the affirmative stood up and was like, China's the biggest threat, we have to contain them or they'll become violent? Yeah, like several of you. So a representations-based criticism of that might ask questions about what it means to label entire swaths of people as threatening, and how perhaps when we base our foreign policy on ideas that certain populations represent a threat, that could cause problems. As well as, ethics, philosophy, epistemology, ontology, the list goes on, and I'll try to define these a little later. How do we do link debating? So in a debate, one of the biggest problems that a lot of debaters run into is that their judge doesn't get their link argument. The link is confusing. Has anyone read a critique and had problems winning a link argument or with your link argument? Anyone? Okay, not a little bit. Has anyone read a critique before in here? Some. Okay, just a couple of people. Okay. So, the best way to improve your link debating is to kind of engage in the process that we just did, but with the 1AC in front of you. So you should read through your opponent's evidence. You should not just read what they've highlighted or what they've underlined, but think through and read everything that is in their 1AC, including the ununderlined portions, including the articles if you have time. Find quotes that are aligned with your link evidence. So if you are reading link evidence that says descriptions of China as a threat result in foreign policy decisions that make war more likely, then the link that you are trying to identify in the 1AC is descriptions of China as a threat. So you'd read through the 1AC and identify places where the affirmative has done that. You then reframe those quotes in terms of the same things that your link evidence is about. And then you make arguments about why those interact with the case and make the AF's impacts more likely or make them inevitable. The second key to better link debating is choice. So choice is important in every argument that you ever go for. It's kind of like an upside down pyramid. You want to have many disagreements with the affirmative at the start, but choose one or two core areas of disagreement in the 2&R in your final rebuttal. The reason for this is that you want to be able to give a lot of depth so that it feels meaningful. Because critiques are not just about making a bunch of arguments, hoping your opponent drops one, extending the dropped argument. They're about winning fundamental premises and fundamental theses, and often they require judges voting against the way that they're taught to think about the world from a young age. And if you're going to convince someone to vote for you despite decades of being told that the world is a different way, then you need to really make them believe it, at least for an instant. The last, and I think the best method, is an essay method. So I think that some of the best critique speeches that have been given the last couple years involved debaters just basically writing an essay about their link evidence and the 1AC they're debating, and then turning that essay into link debating in blocks. You do not want to read a whole essay, because your judge cannot flow a whole essay. Cannot do that. But that's one really easy way, maybe not an easy way, easy is the wrong word. That's one very effective way of improving your link debating, especially if you're new. I wish that when I first started learning critiques, I'd learned this tip and I'd actually done it, because it gets you to really think through all of the different implications of your link arguments. Okay. Anyone have questions about link debating? No? Okay. All right, impact. So the impact, rather than defining impacts as the effects of a cause, which is how we thought about it earlier and how we think about it for other arguments, I like the much more simple definition of the impact as who cares. Why should your judge care about your link? For the previous example of this notion that human creativity relies on a certain form of intelligence that's historically been weaponized in violent ways, perhaps a reasonable answer to this, a reasonable retort, would be to say, who cares? Not in the sense of who cares about slavery, but in the sense of, the 1AC didn't say that, right? Nowhere in our affirmative did we say, we should maximize human creativity. By the way, only white people can be creative. No AF is saying that, right? So we have to be able to identify the reason that we should care about the assumption that we've criticized. And traditionally, the way we think about impacts is A leads to B leads to C, right? If we pass the Farm Bill, that would include climate provisions, which solves global warming. Solving global warming solves food crises. Solving food crises saves lots of lives, right? It's very linear. One thing leads to the next thing, leads to the next thing. We got to rethink this without fully abandoning it. And this is really, really difficult. It's really difficult. We have to be able to get our judge to care, but we have to do so in a way that both responds to the language of opportunity costs that our opponents are attempting to make the debate about, without fully playing their game. And there's kind of three ways to deal with the idea that case outweighs, right? So in our previous example of our link argument about human creativity, a likely affirmative response is to say, I hear you that some of the assumptions of the affirmative might have some problematic underpinnings, but the case is more important because it solves an existential risk, and existential risks matter more. And there's kind of three ways to deal with this. Way one, is read a K with big impacts. What's an example of a K with big impacts? A lot of big impacts. Yeah.
I think capitalism.
Capitalism K, right. So if we're saying the capitalism K, which is the critique in the starter packet that some of you have, some of you will get today at some point, there are all kinds of existential risks associated with capitalism. Marxists write all the time. If you open up the monthly review, every week there's a new slew of articles about how we're all going to die in the next decade because of something that capitalism has caused. It's the reason that people go to war with each other because they fight over resources or they fight over ideology. It's the root cause of environmental destruction because environment is reduced down purely to its use value. So like how can we use it to make the most money? It is the reason why we are likely to go to space to expand, which will cause us to come into contact with aliens who will eat us for breakfast. All of these things are a result of capitalism, and that is one approach to debating big impacts. Second is an impact framing argument. An impact framing argument. This can occur in a myriad of ways. Generally in debate, magnitude is kind of a trump card, so whoever has the largest impact tends to have a much better chance of winning. But critiques can say the idea of what is a larger impact ought to also be challenged. Right? The idea of what is the larger impact can also be challenged. In debate, for whatever reason, we've more or less decided on a version of utilitarianism to assess impacts that says we should decide debates based on who saves the most lives. Right? So number of lives saved. Critique arguments can say, instead, we should prioritize issues like race, or we should prioritize gender, or we should prioritize people who have been historically oppressed rather than treating everyone as equal, because notions of equality have never existed and are always been a farce. And so that's kind of like option number 2, is identify a different impact than what the 1AC has presented, and then make a series of philosophical arguments explaining why that should matter more. And then the third is something called framework. Can anyone define framework?
How the judge should evaluate the round.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good one. So how should the judge evaluate the round? Specifically, how should the judge evaluate link arguments? How should the judge evaluate link arguments? Traditionally, again, link arguments are things that the plan causes. But if a link means some other thing, and that other thing that is not the plan can be the basis for the decision, then we can make framework arguments that say if we win a link argument, then we should win regardless of whether the plan is a good idea or not. So a classic example of this might be, let's say that you are negative, the affirmative is winning that the plan is a good idea, but they have repeatedly used racial slurs. And the negative is like, who cares whether the plan's a good idea? You should not be able to say a bunch of racial slurs and win. If you are judging a debate like this, would any of you vote for the team who is using racial slurs constantly, even though they're winning that the plan's a good idea? Who's like, I'm AF in this debate? Okay, so maybe someone, I don't know. But I think a lot of people are probably voting neg, right? Most people are probably like, I'm voting negative. You can't like abuse your opponents. You can't do that. And given that that's true, right? Given that there are instances in which we would ignore the plan and decide the debate based on some other thing, that demonstrates that there could be other instances where we do the same thing. We would say, whether the plan is a good idea or a bad idea, there are things that you've done that constitute a loss. So again, regardless of whether the plan is a good idea or a bad idea, there are certain things you've done in the debate that constitute a loss. And so that's typically the way framework deals with case outlays. Does anyone have questions about any of these three approaches to dealing with case outlays? No? Okay. All right, so uniqueness. Okay. Every one of your labs, including my lab and including me, has probably taught uniqueness the same way, which is that uniqueness is what is going on now. There's nothing wrong with that, but I don't think it's as precise as it could be. I think instead, uniqueness is offense specific to a world. It's offense that is specific to a world. The reason for this is because counterplans, right? When you read a counterplan, it changes uniqueness, right? So the offense that the affirmative has in the world that is the squo is the whole case, right? All three advantages. Yes? Make sense? The uniqueness for offense when the affirmative is debating the court's counterplan is reduced to solely that which the court's counterplan doesn't access. So to put in more simple terms, if I have advantage A, advantage B, advantage C, then the uniqueness in that world is all of the things in A, B, and C. If the negative presents a counterplan, do A, do B, do not do C, then it changes uniqueness. Uniqueness in that world is only what's going on in advantage C, because A and B do not have uniqueness anymore. There's no offense unique to that world. I think thinking about uniqueness in this way is kind of a necessary step to thinking about uniqueness in critique land. So the alternative is your uniqueness. It's your new way of thinking about the world, a new ethos, so a new way of being. It sets conditions for what offense is relevant and what offense is not relevant. Does anyone have questions about alternative and uniqueness? Okay. So alternatives can accomplish a lot of different things. The basic thing the alternative needs to do is provide uniqueness for your link argument. So let's take capitalism as an example. So we've got the affirmative, we've got our critique. Our critique is the affirmative participates in capitalism. What is fundamentally the uniqueness problem with the sentence, the affirmative participates in capitalism? Yeah?
It's assuming that they're capitalists.
Well, so that's about the link. I'm asking, what is the uniqueness problem? Right? So I'll give you another try. So I'm like, make generative AI pay for licensing. And you say, that sounds capitalist. Okay, like maybe it's capitalist. What do we do about it? Okay, so, yeah, right. So the problem with this idea and the problem with most critiques is it's identifying problems that are just as true of the status quo as they are of the plan. So if we do the plan, it's capitalist. If we do nothing, there's still capitalism. The way that we approach intellectual property is capitalist, whether we do the plan or we don't do the plan. And so if all you did was identify the assumptions in the affirmative and say this is capitalist, then you wouldn't have a way of winning because you have no way of resolving that link argument. And so your alternative exists to resolve this problem of all of the impacts are inevitable. Right? All of the impacts are inevitable unless you could resolve them in some way. Or, because alternatives are not opportunity costs in a traditional way, have some other means of resolving offense that is different from solvency. Alright, there's kind of four classic ones. I call them the 4 R's. There's reject, rethink, reimagine, and refuse. So reject, rethink, reimagine, refuse. These are all very similar to each other, but you see them all the time. Has anyone seen one of these 4 R's come up? Anyone read a critique with one of these? Yeah. What was it?
Think, reject.
Reject. Okay. In what context? What are you rejecting?
Brain's not working right now.
Oh, that's fine. Anyone else debate a rejection alternative that says the alternative is to reject and then like a thing? Yeah.
Yeah, I did a cap K rejected their world of a capitalist society at 5 states. I think we should communist utopia.
Yeah, so reject capitalism and rethink the economy around communism. That's a classic. Okay. These all are often dismissed as doing nothing. And so the AF will often be like, voting negative is the same as doing nothing. It's useless, it's pointless, everything that they've said, irrelevant. Has anyone heard this in response to their critique before? Or anyone said this to answer a critique? Yeah, you have? Okay. So this is from an article by Tiffany King about the R words, from an article called R Words Refusing Research. This article is really, really good. One of the couple that I'll recommend reading that will really help you understand the premise of critiques much, much better. Because Tiffany King is a better writer than me. So Tiffany King writes, what is theoretically generative about these refusals? Refusals are not subtractive, but are generative, expansive. Refusal is not just a no, but a redirection to ideas otherwise unacknowledged. A generative practice is making Western thought turn back upon itself, as opposed to universal neutral knowledge without a horizon. What this does is question uninterrogated assumptions and exposes particularities of the meta-narrative. There's a lot of confusing words in this. Anyone have some ideas about what King is saying in this card? What's King saying? Anyone? Yeah.
Like refusals aren't like taking away from things, but provide like redirecting to other things.
Yeah. Right. So has any okay. Have you ever had a time in your lives when a parent or a friend or a teacher told you to do something, you refused to do it, and it felt like you were taking a stance? Like you were taking a stand, you were taking an action? Right? So when someone is like, do this, and you refuse to do it, there's 2 ways of thinking about that. There's one way, and it's like, oh yeah, you've done nothing, you've accomplished nothing. And there's another, which I think is much more familiar to us, which is that refusing to do a thing you're told to do is a generative practice. It might feel good. Has anyone refused to do something and it felt good? Yeah, a couple of people. Has anyone consistently refused to do a thing and that resulted in the other person stopping to ask them to do that thing? Yeah? Right, so refusal has enormous amounts of power. So rejection has a lot of power. And we often think of refusal and rejection as just the opposite of action. And King, in this article, and in a lot of articles in this literature base, are trying to define them as actions in of themselves. That there is a lot of power to saying no. How can we analogize this to a debate? So again, let's take the example of the capitalism critique. The neg is like, the 1AC participates in the logic of capitalism. Capitalism is really bad because it exploits the environment. We should reject capitalism. The AF is like, rejecting capitalism does nothing. You're useless. How can we use this idea to answer that argument? Mm-hmm.
So by refusing to do the plan, you don't contribute to capitalism, I guess?
So you don't contribute to capitalism, but that's still kind of thinking in terms of what is not instead of what is. So what what is the act of refusing capitalism do? What is that? Why is it generative, to use King's term? Yeah.
It changes the status quo.
It could change the status quo, yeah. In what way?
Like if you say no to capitalism, then you could change the form of government theoretically.
You could, yeah, over time, right? You could refuse to participate in the set of things that hold it up. So you might say that capitalism only maintains itself because we all willingly participate in it. But if we were to extend the logic of refusal to every instance of it, it would collapse under its own contradictions, right? Okay, other ideas?
About like capitalism, like it would set a precedent for how we behave, like regarding.
Yeah, it could set a precedent that says that in instances when something is capitalist, we should refuse to do it. So another one that I would encourage you to think about is the power of saying, I don't need further explanation for why we should refuse it if it's capitalist. An easier way to think about this is like sexism, for example. Let's say that the affirmative does something that's sexist, and you say you should refuse to vote for them, they did something sexist. And the affirmative's response is like, that does nothing because sexism happens all the time, who cares? Why is that logic dangerous?
You're allowing sex.
It's like normalizing it. You're like normalizing something that's morally like known.
Yeah, right. It's normalizing it. And also, there's a lot of power in saying, I shouldn't have to explain why sexism is bad. It's bad because it is bad. It is an axiom. It is bad because it's bad and it exists on its own. Right? There shouldn't be I shouldn't need to provide some cause and effect solution to it. Simply identifying it and refusing it should be enough. And the idea that the notion should be on the person levying the accusation to explain why we should care is exactly why it's so normalized. Is because you always have to justify why someone should care about something unfair happening. And simply identifying that something unfair has occurred should be sufficient. And it's generative because if we were to imagine that that is just how issues were resolved, that when someone does something racist or sexist, the response is to refuse that thing, and then when they ask for a justification, you tell them, I don't need to justify why racism is bad to you. And the fact you want an explanation from me is in fact the problem, so I encourage you to go home and rethink that. That would be incredibly powerful if that's how we dealt with these kinds of harms. And I think those are some other things that King is inviting us to think through. Okay, so that's kind of alternatives. Okay, this is a classic quote. Anyone heard this before? Yeah? You have? Yeah. So, oops. Our imaginations are really constrained. They're really constrained. And it's really strange. Anyone ever think about how when you're young, you're encouraged to imagine fantastical things and you're praised for it? Like when you say, like, I want to grow up and be like, whatever, like a ballerina on the moon or a Supreme Court justice or a professional hockey player, that's like praised and encouraged when you're young. But then you get a little older, you get into middle school, you start getting homework, you get into high school, and all of a sudden, your imagination is constrained. And now when you're like, oh, I want to do X or Y or Z, you're told that's not realistic or it's time for you to grow up. Anyone been told, like, you got to grow up and have more realistic goals? Right? Yeah, almost everyone, right? And so the educational system, not just in the US, but everywhere, purposefully and constantly teaches us that we ought to constrain our imaginations and start thinking about what is probable and what is likely rather than what is possible. And policy debate is no different. One of the common retorts to critiques is, it might be nice to have a world without capitalism, but it's not realistic. Or it might be nice if there was no more sexism in the world, but that's just how it is. You just gotta grin and bear it. You just gotta deal with it. That's just what life's like. And what if it didn't have to be? What if kind of the reason that we think all these things are inevitable is because we've accepted the premise that they are? And critiques oftentimes are, and alternatives in particular, just tell us we ought question assumptions that are taken for granted. We ought to question assumptions that are taken for granted. This is the best book I've read in 2024 by Ruha Benjamin. It's called Imagination, a Manifesto. It's I could send you a copy of the PDF if you're interested, but you can also buy the book and support her. She actually writes a little bit about debate too. There's a group called Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, which is a group of mostly former debaters in Baltimore who are doing advocacy work, and there's a chapter of this book that is about that group. And there's also a section of this book about redistribution. There's like some stuff about basic income and jobs guarantee, if those are familiar terms to you. But I like this section because I think that it is extremely applicable to the way that we think about impacts in debate. So I'll give people a second to read it. And then I want to hear thoughts. All right. So I'll read it to you. They don't talk real issues: racism, sexism, imperialism, long-termism, flourishing of imaginary future rather than right here, right now. We hear long-termism echoing a eugenics calculus that some believe we have left in the dustbins of history. The weak must be sacrificed so the strong survive. The long-term potential of imaginary future people rather than working to alleviate suffering here and now. Those pesky feel-good projects like eliminating poverty, addressing climate change, and preventing wars. All of us, teachers, students, policymakers, journalists, artists, business people, gig workers, and those pushed to the margin should take this warped imagination seriously. Commit to keeping a critical antenna tuned into nightmarish fantasies. Those who monopolize resources monopolize imagination. If policymakers accept eugenic calculus necessary, there is no telling what suffering they will justify. As each new generation expands their imagination, let them also develop a keener ability to detect BS, foster discernment between well-being and faux fables. Choice is not between solidarity and indifference. If our imagination turns its back on those buried under social structures in the here and now, they can only ever be ish. All right. Anyone know what long-termism is? By the way, what Benjamin is criticizing? Anyone heard of long-termism? Okay, so long-termism stems from a kind of new age philosophy called effective altruism. Long-termism says that the way that we should think about what things we should prioritize is that which affects humanity's long-term future. The reason for this is that time should exist on a way, way longer scale than what's happening now. So if we only think about what matters for the next year or decade or the next century, then we're really limiting our horizons, because humanity could exist for thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. And if we think of humanity as a group of 8 billion people who are living here and now, we're ignoring future lives and future generations. And if we take into account the humanity of 100 years from now, then that could be a multiplanetary species with tens of billions of people, or 1,000 years from now, or 10,000 years from now. And so there are potentially hundreds of billions of lives hanging in the balance when we think about what policies to prioritize. and the way that we should assess what actions are ethical and what actions are unethical should take into account all of humanity's future and not just the humans that are alive today. This section of the book is kind of criticizing that logic. And that is a logic that has become really embedded into the social fabric of debate. If you go to a tournament, I would say nearly all of the debate rounds presume this viewpoint almost without question for how we should think about what matters and what doesn't matter. So given that background, hopefully that helps a little bit. What is this section of this book about?
The flaw of believing eugenic beliefs of sacrificing the weak and not just wanting to survive the future. Simply saying that utilitarianism and long-termism are ultimately short-sighted when it comes to benefit of all of humanity, and damages those that are not deemed worthy enough to survive.
Yeah. True. Other ideas? Just one.
That like the structure of our thinking is flawed because we keep people from thinking their own beliefs by focusing on beliefs that the rest of the world wants us to think.
Yeah, right. So the structure of our beliefs are really limited. They're really constrained. So you said by what the rest of the world wants us to believe. I don't think that's exactly what this evidence is saying. I think it's saying who is it identifying as the source of belief or the source of constraints on belief. There's like a really clear line. So who is it saying determines what the scope of our imagination is? Yeah.
Is it the rich?
Yeah, it's people with the most resources, right? So people with a lot of resources, more or less, determine the set of futures that we can imagine. Because who has ever had a conversation with someone and you propose a way of changing the world and the other person is like, well, that'll never happen because elites won't allow it. Like Walmart will never let this happen. Or oil companies will never let that happen. Has anyone had a conversation that went like that? Yeah? Yeah, it kind of happens all the time. And so this evidence is also kind of about the danger of constraining our imagination to what we are told it should be. Right? So it's this right here. Those who monopolize resources monopolize imagination. So right here. Anyways, this book, very, very good. A lot of it is about AI and property as well. And so I think it is among the best books you could read for learning how to do better impact calculus in critique debates and how to do better link debating. Because each chapter of the book is kind of just like about debate. It's not about debate, but it feels as if it is. Okay. All right. Next, how to win going for critique. There's kind of three really common win conditions. The first one I'm going to talk about a ton. I would call it a framework K. Mr. Stupek, our visiting scholar from the University of Georgia, describes this as framework no plans. If you're interested in learning way more about this, there's a lecture that I have recorded. It's on YouTube called If Plan, No Win. But I'll go into that more in a second. The second and third one, link outweighs and turns the case, alternative avoids them. This is very similar to the packet cap K. So you identify a problem with the affirmative, you identify why that problem is a really, really, really big deal, and then you explain why voting negative solves or avoids that problem. The reason 2 and 3 are different is because this one does not care if the alternative solves the affirmative. So it does not care if the alt solves the F. What do I mean by that? Whether or not IP is strengthened or whether copyright protections are strengthened This version doesn't care. Okay, it requires that the alternative resolve the link arguments, and then relies on winning the links matter more than the affirmative. Right? So the 1AC is capitalist. Capitalism is the biggest impact. The alternative solves capitalism. When presented with a choice between the affirmative and the alternative, even if the alternative solves none of the affirmative, it doesn't matter because it solves the links, and the links outweigh the affirmative. This second one is a little different because it is much more like the first, like the critique that is counterplan plus DA, and it says that the alternative does solve the affirmative. So it would say the alternative does in fact resolve the problem with copyright protections, and then there's some external important reason to care. Does anyone have questions about the difference between those two models? Anyone? Okay. All right. Well, next. So the rest of this lecture is basically just about framework. This is from a really good movie called Dr. Strangelove, and it's in my top 10 movies of all time. Also would recommend this. If you watch this movie and understand this movie, you could win critique debates. All right. Premise 1, if plan, no win. Framework arguments are structured very similar to topicality. They have an interpretation, they have a violation, and they have reasons to prefer it. Okay? They're very similar to topicality. Most framework arguments now rely on this notion that the plan is not the central focus of the debate. So the plan is not the central focus of the debate. Rather than deciding debates on solely whether the outcome of the plan is good or bad, we should instead think about the 1AC as a whole. We should think about the 1AC as a whole. The reason for this is that the set of research practices, or the set of search terms that we use, the set of ideas that go into the structure of the affirmative, what advantages we choose to read, how we choose to describe other countries, how we choose to think about intelligence, how we choose to think about property, all of these go into determining whether the affirmative is a good idea or a bad idea. So the sentence, I voted affirmative because I think the 1AC is the best way to protect intellectual property, bakes in the assumption that protecting intellectual property is desirable. It bakes in the assumption that property is a thing that should exist. It relies on the assumption that intellectual property is something that is distinct from regular property. It relies on the assumption that we should do that which is good. And every single one of these things, the more layers you unpeel, the more reasons and more objections to the 1AC that you could find. Putting on our AF hat for a second, what might be a problem with this framework argument? Anyone have an issue with this? If you're affirmative reading the starter pack at AF, the negative is like, we shouldn't determine the winner based on whether the plan's a good idea. We should assess the entire 1AC holistically, and if we win any component of the 1AC is bad, we should win. Yeah?
It destroys topic education.
Why? My critique is about why intellectual property is a myth and constructed by Western capitalists and is violent. That seems like topic education.
By making it on the ideologies, you take away from the key part of copyright and shift it towards the other issues. Why is the critique not the key point? Like, what is it that makes you think that the affirmative has identified the key point? What if the key point is whether the United States federal government should exist? Right? The first words in the resolution are the United States federal government should. What if I said, we live on stolen land and the federal government is an illegitimate actor and we should not imagine the solutions to our problems being done by a colonizing entity. And your response to this objection is like, that's not really the point, man. Like, who cares? That's not, the main point is copyright law, obviously, not 300 years of genocide. What else? Yeah?
We have to focus on improving the present and have to make sure that we can account for the past and the present. And the only way to do that is through the plan, because the critique focuses too much on the past that we can't change, so we have to focus on changing in the present.
Okay, so then I make an argument about why the existence of the federal government maintains violent colonial logics for indigenous peoples on an everyday basis. So now my critique is about the present. I've now resolved your problem. Yes? Anyone else? Yeah?
It wastes an entire speech for the app and shifts the entire debate to the next speaker because they stop talking. Now the entire point of the debate changes and app as well as speech.
So the second thing you said I think is good. It shifts the debate towards the negative. That seems true. I don't think we want to say it's a waste of time. If we're like, here's the plan, the neg is like, the set of assumptions undergirding the plan are racist, and you're like, talking about racism, waste of time, that's not the look we want. But being like, that arbitrarily favors the negative and skews the debate towards the negative, that is much, much closer to the affirmative response we want to make. So why does it favor the negative? Why does it favor the negative if the negative can make the debate about something that is not the plan? CJ, yeah.
Because the affirmative can't possibly know in advance what they could make the debate about, so they can make it about anything.
Yeah, so I want to repeat that. So CJ has said the reason it skews the debate is because the affirmative cannot possibly know in advance what the negative was going to make the debate about. Because it could be anything. Like the whole thing we've been talking about the last hour has been about broaden your horizons, imagine anything. Any idea you think of can turn into an argument. It creates infinite possibilities for negative strategy that the affirmative cannot possibly predict. And so it creates debates that are skewed heavily towards one direction because rather than the resolution being the stasis point for discussion, the negative can change the parameters and terms of the debate to whatever they want, to whatever best suits them and whatever is most convenient to them. So that's kind of the core of what your affirmative objection to everything that I'm about to talk about should be, is that it manipulates and warps the terms of the debate in a way that unfairly skews debate towards the negative. And so that is the basis of the AF answer to a lot of this stuff. All right, premise 2, ethical distancing. I don't have to read this quote out loud, but it's here. It's also from the Benjamin book. But can anyone define ethical distancing? Yeah.
Moving yourself away from the ethical way of doing something in order to make yourself feel more comfortable with what you're used to.
Yeah. So that's kind of that's a pretty good definition, a pretty good working definition. I like that. Anyone else? Ethical distancing. What is an example of ethical distancing that the starter packet app participates in? Yeah.
I think it's something about virtue.
What?
Virtue ethics and.
Okay. So virtue ethics is a system of evaluating moral goods that is very old. It stems from some old Greek guys. They're really into virtue ethics, and a lot of people have written about it since then. It's not quite what I'm asking about, but your answer isn't wrong. It's just a little bit different than what I'm thinking of. So ethical distancing is the core premise of almost every affirmative, because every AF identifies a problem that is outside of debate, that is outside of our capacity to affect, identifies an agent, the federal government's role in that problem. And so it never allows us to ask ourselves, how do we as individuals contribute to these problems? and what can we as individuals do about them. Because it identifies, again, a problem that we have no capacity to affect and a solution that we have no capacity to affect. And it really lowers the ethical stakes of debate. It makes it much easier for us to not be too concerned about stuff because we have no effect on the outcome anyways. It allows us to think of debate purely just as a game. And so a core premise of your framework argument is that the logic of problem solution, where we imagine the federal government taking an action, distances us from our own personal responsibilities towards the people that we think the plan affects. And that instead, debate should be about what we can actually do something about, what we can change. Okay. Premise 3, fairness is delusion. Fairness is delusion. So, the first thing that I kind of got you all to think about, and CJ helped us out to get there, is this notion that critiques are unfair because they change the horizon of what is predictable and what is unpredictable. When you're neg, you often want to criticize this premise of fairness and critique the notion that debate can ever be fair. What are some ways that debate is not a particularly fair activity that is totally independent of whether or not, of what arguments are being made? Yeah.
Spreading, person spreads fast, you can't understand what arguments they're making.
Yeah, spreading is unbelievably unfair, right? If you were like in high school, you're a couple of years in, you're like a junior, you hear about debate, you go to a tournament, round one, you're debating someone, they're speaking at 300 words per minute. No matter how smart you are or how hard you work, you could have worked hundreds of hours to prepare for that tournament, but if no one had told you what spreading was and you never heard it before, you would probably lose immediately because none of your preparation would matter because you wouldn't be able to answer all of your opponent's arguments. So that's kind of a pretty easy example of a baked-in thing about debate that is completely unfair to one side if they don't know about it. Yeah?
It's really expensive.
It's really expensive. It's unbelievably expensive. Tournament fees, online debate has helped with this to some extent, for sure. But even not being able to debate in person is unfair. Coaching is really expensive. Debate camp, really expensive. So there are all kinds of external things that make debate really unfair. What else? Yeah.
Not just expenses, but also like coaching preparation. Like if you don't have like the resources for a good coach, you won't have the cards that you need to like win the debate against.
Yeah, absolutely. Coaching is another one. Yeah.
People's like mental capacities and ability to like understand and answer things.
Yeah, in the sense that we learn things differently, right? Like some people are visual learners, for example. If you're a visual learner who processes information best from like a video or pictures, debate is automatically going to be way harder for you because debate is extremely text oriented. Yeah, CJ.
The whole idea of how you're supposed to carry yourself, like you're supposed to be really like calm and articulate and like if you're not when you're being hysterical, like that's sort of not fair.
Yeah, right. So this notion of calmness, being articulate, having the right demeanor. There's all kinds of racist and sexist and normative assumptions that go into what constitutes a persuasive and proper speaker. One more. Yeah.
Like the actual structure of the debate, so without
The actual structure too, sure. Yeah. And so one of the premises of the negative's answer to this fairness idea is that nothing about debate is fair. It's never been fair. And nothing about voting AF or neg has much effect on making this particular debate more fair. It's just this thing that we delude ourselves into thinking we could capture when we can't. Don came in on fairness is delusion. What's that?
What I worked on last night.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Good for you, Don. Okay, premise 4, research.
Okay, so if fairness is a delusion, and if the central point of debate being the plan results in a form of ethical distancing that doesn't teach us, how we can become better people, what is it that debate can accomplish? And the thing that I would say debate can accomplish is the way we think. It can affect how we think about the world. It can affect what sources we think of as credible. It can affect what types of things that we value. And it can affect what type of research we do. And there's a way of thinking about research that is extremely agnostic on the content. So you'll hear all the time that debate is not a search for truth. It's content agnostic. And whether or not we're making arguments that advance a conservative agenda or a liberal agenda or an agenda that is violent or an agenda that is ethical, none of that matters. The only thing that should matter is who does the better debating. And a lot of critique debating says that that is a premise that is bad. It is bad for us to be agnostic on what we say, that what we say does in fact matter, that the things we research and learn about do change how we think about the world, and that there is value to debate beyond simply identifying winning arguments and losing arguments, and that the person we are when we leave the activity is different than the person that we are when we start the activity. And most of that comes from the research process. And the only way to encourage people to do different types of research is if we allow for arguments about that process of research and about how we go about thinking about the world, the set of assumptions that go into it, the justifications, etc. And if we reject that notion and say it's solely a question of the plan, then the thing we learn from debate is that we should not care if what we argue about is ethical or unethical. We should only care about how good we are at arguing for it. Anyone have opinions about this? I don't think there's really a wrong answer, but yeah.
I like the idea of using evidence outside the fact because it kind of makes it really hard for the other to prepare. It makes it hard to prepare properly. And sometimes it can just lead to an unfun debate because if they truly can't answer any of your arguments, then you kind of just destroy the whole point of the debate.
Okay, so you're saying debate is valuable when both sides know what's going on, basically. Okay, yeah. I think I agree with you. I think I generally agree that debates are much better if both sides have an idea of what's happening. Other thoughts? Anyone think that debate should be completely agnostic on content? That it should not matter whether what you're saying is true or false whatsoever. It should only matter how good you are at arguing for it. Keats, you think this? Why?
Because I believe truth is very subjective, and I believe that everyone should be able to argue. It depends on the argument. The whole purpose of debate is to measure the value of one's ability to argue for a belief.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that is there any such thing as an objective truth, or do you think that there's no objective truth whatsoever?
I believe objectivity is in itself, in its entirety, is the subjectivity you don't want to argue, and so therefore, I guess in a sense I don't.
You don't? Okay. Anyone disagree with Keats? Anyone think that there are things that are always good and things that are always bad? CJ, yeah.
I think that if we assume that there's no objective truth that has dangerous implications, not everything is like a philosophical thought experiment, some things have implications for the real world. So if we don't set ethical parameters for ourselves based on what is true and what is not true, then yeah, I just don't think that's good.
Yeah, so for example, what if I fabricated evidence and I beat you on a bunch of fabricated evidence? You would say there's no objective truth, nothing matters. I should have been able to catch the fact that it was fabricated. No harm, no foul. Shame on me, not shame on you, right?
No, not quite. I believe that what I believe is that objectivity in itself is simply subjectivity we don't want to defend. With that being said, I acknowledge that still exists in a form. I just believe that its form can be taken as definitive as people do take it. I still acknowledge that objectivity exists in the world, and people have their own subjective beliefs that they don't want to actually have to argue about.
Okay, so all right, I want to unpack this. So Keats has said objectivity, objective truths are subjective truths we don't feel comfortable defending. Anyone have a take about this? Yeah.
Well, I think it's like there are objective truths in the real world, but as you were saying about the K before, there's like a point where you need to to argue with someone, like to convince someone of a belief, you need to be able to understand their opinion, and debate teaches us to understand our opinion. And also you can just say like the negative is inherently only reading this K to win. So if they agree that the value of debate is not in argument and winning, then they're not then they're just going they shouldn't be able to win on this because they're accepting that premise by fighting to win with this K.
Sure, that makes sense to me. Anyone have thoughts on this idea that's been added, which is that the neg is only reading the K because they want to win, and so you should be skeptical of all of their philosophizing about truth and all of the big words they're using?
Yeah, but isn't that called charity cannibalism? Or is like that the argument that is made?
Say more about what do you mean by charity cannibalism? Can you define that for the rest of us?
All cases, but like you know, how charity cannibalism is like saying that they're trying to run like this, even though they don't actually relate to like what the act they're running for is, or K they're running for is about.
Yeah, so I would kind of think about charity cannibalism. To backtrack, to think about it more simply, charity cannibalism is the idea that people really, really want there to be oppression in the world, so then they can feel good about contributing to charity. So people who donate to help people living in poverty and then feel good about it, when they make that donation, they subconsciously desire that there be poverty so that they can feel good about their donations to charities fighting poverty. And a lot of affirmatives in debate mirror this logic. If there were no problems in the world, it would be really hard to be affirmative. And when you're doing research in debate, has anyone done research in debate and gotten a little bit of excitement when they figure out something really, really bad in the world because now they get to write an AF that solves it or write a DA about it? Yeah? Right? A classic example is like, anyone debate the Ukraine DA last year? Anyone? Yeah? Anyone like who thinks that we should in fact give aid to Ukraine be like, I really hope Congress doesn't pass this until after the tournament because like I really need to be able to go for the Ukraine DA this weekend? Anyone have that thought? Yeah, so debate kind of like teaches us to think like this a little bit, where we really, really need the world to have problems so that we can have solutions. Because if there are not problems, then there will be no need for our solutions. So that's kind of an explanation of that. Anyone else? Anyone think that we should, in fact, care about whether our research practices are ethical?
Yeah, I think that the whole reason why debate is good is because you learn things, and if your debate research isn't on something that's real, then that defeats the purpose. Like maybe we should be caring about who writes our evidence and why.
Yeah.
If he's like horribly racist, then that defeats the purpose of like learning things.
Yeah, like if our evidence uses racist assumptions, or if we read, let's say that we're reading a card that says climate change is not real, and the author has received contributions from fossil fuel companies in order to conduct the study that they're premising their conclusions on. Is that something we should care about? Maybe. And critiques kind of often get at those questions. And they say that the only reason you think the plan is a good idea, that you could come to the conclusion, I voted affirmative to require generative AI companies to buy licensing, is because you've embedded a set of assumptions that are wrong. And if you were to change those assumptions, then you would realize
that your reasoning for your conclusion is wrong. And importantly, crucially, the negative is not saying that it is a bad idea to require companies to pay for licensing. That is not what the critique is about generally. Instead, it's saying the reason you think we should do that is bad. It could be the case that it is a good idea to require licensing. That could be true. But before we decide whether it is objectively a good idea to require licensing or objectively a bad idea, we first must ask ourselves, why is it that we think it is good? Why is it that we think it is bad? If our reasons for thinking it's good are flawed, then that is a more important question than whether or not it's good or bad. The reason for this, to kind of tie everything we've discussed the last 20 minutes or so together, is because you and I have no effect, really, on whether or not Congress does the affirmative. Basically none whatsoever. Voting aft does not result in the plan happening. Voting negative does not prevent the plan from happening. But we do have an effect on how we think about the world going forward. We do have an effect on what kind of research that we do. And we can have an effect on what kinds of lives we might lead. And so the most meaningful impact in terms of what change to the world can occur as a result of debate is that which affects us as people, not that which affects governments. Because we can affect each other, we cannot affect governments. And that's this part right here. You can't change the state, but you can change the state of debate. Okay. All right, so going to kind of rapid fire go through types of critiques. So one is critiques of language. So these are about representations, discourse, and rhetoric. These are, say, the plan may be a good idea. The plan may be a good idea, but the way that you've endorsed it is bad. Right? The way you've gone about talking about it is a bad thing. So you might be right, but the words you've used to explain why you're right are offensive or harmful or inaccurate or imprecise. Anyone think that there are circumstances in which we should, where if someone endorses an idea but it does it for the wrong reasons, that that's bad? Or do we think that we should always try to do the right thing regardless of our reasoning? Like, how should we determine whether an action is good or bad? Yeah?
Based on both the thought process behind it and the consequences, because the thought process behind it can have an impact on the consequences and how those are implemented.
Okay, so that's a really good answer. So the answer was both, because our reasons can affect the outcome. That still bakes in the assumption that ultimately it's the outcome that matters. Who here thinks that sometimes only the reasons matter and the outcome is totally irrelevant? It's only why we do the thing that matters. Yeah.
I mean, like, yeah, like if you do something with bad intentions and it ends up working out well, then I would still say it's like a bad thing to do inherently. Like I think that's not moral even if it has like a benefit for someone.
Yeah, like for example, a really easy one. If you've cheated on a test and you never got caught, you could say that's a bad thing because it will teach you to continue cheating and you might eventually get caught. That's one way of saying that that's bad. You could say it's good. You cheated on the test, didn't get caught, you got a good grade, so it's good. The third way of looking at it is that cheating on tests is bad. And whether or not cheating on tests makes you more likely or less likely to do it in the future is irrelevant, because cheating is bad because it's bad. It is bad under its own assumptions. And so I think that's like an easy example for us to wrap our minds around for what this type of thing is getting at. A lot of critiques are about metaphysics. I don't have really the time to get into all the different metaphysical critiques that are popular in debate. But it is a branch of philosophy that deals with the first principle of things, such as being, knowing, substance, identity, time, or space. So when the 1AC says plan, require licensing for generative artificial intelligence, a metaphysical question might be, what is intelligence? Or, what does it mean to take an action? Or what is intellectual? What makes something intellectual? And you can challenge those baked-in assumptions in the statement, the United States federal government should require licensing. Epistemology, we covered this, yes. Does everyone feel like they have a good notion of what epistemology is? Yeah, so it is the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? There's this word. Anyone seen this word in a debate round?
Can you give examples for each different kind? Because the difference makes sense abstractly, but thinking about just common case, I can't really think of one that would fall into.
Well, let's do it. So language. What's an example of a language K? Yeah.
Femke.
Huh?
Femke.
Say more. What is a link for the feminism critique that is about language?
It's bad to be overly masculine in debate.
Bad to what?
Be overly masculine in debate.
Okay, but let's give a more specific example. What is an example of gendered language? Yeah.
Mother Earth.
Mother Earth. Great. That is an example of a language critique. So let's use feminism for each one of these, actually. So an example of a language-based critique for a critique about feminism would be gendered language, so ideas of Mother Earth, or manned spaceship. Misgendering could be an example of a language-based critique, yes? How about metaphysics? What is a, if we took feminism as a broad category, what is a metaphysical question that feminists might ask? Yes?
Like why gender roles are the way that they are?
Why what?
Gender roles are the way that they are.
Yeah, like what is a man, what is a woman, right? That is potentially a metaphysical question. Why is it that we think that they're different? What is gender? How should we conceptualize gender? Why is gender a concept at all? There are all kinds of metaphysical questions there. Epistemology, feminism critique. What is an epistemological question? Yeah.
If all of the study of history has been done primarily through the lens of men, by men for men, then the way that we know things isn't accurate to everybody.
That's a perfect example. So to repeat for those who didn't hear, if the way we think about stuff is by looking at history, and history has been written largely by men for men, then how can we be sure that this history is an accurate portrayal and not a biased portrayal? Yeah. I was just reading this book recently called A History of Art Without Men. Some of you may have heard of this book. It was a big deal in the New York Times a couple of months ago. But anyone feel like when they learn about history of artists, every single artist you learn about is a guy? All of them, every single one over. There are counterexamples, right? I'm sure that some of you can name Frida Kahlo, for example. There are many, many prominent artists who are women who were taught about in classrooms. But for the most part, the titans of art are all men. And so this book imagines that there are no male artists ever and just traces the same history of art of the Renaissance, Impressionism, the Baroque period, the Rococo period, etc., but only uses women as the artists that it goes through, and it kind of reteaches art history as if the titans of art were all women. And it's just that's I think kind of an example of what you're getting at, right? Okay. Ontology. So this is the study of being. So what is what is essence? What is an ontology question? Now ontology is also a metaphysical question. But for the feminism critique, what is an example of an ontological question that feminists ask? Anyone who hasn't spoken have an idea? So just think to be. So ontology asks, what does it mean to be? We kind of already referenced this earlier. Mm-hmm.
Maybe what is being a woman?
Yeah, like what is a woman, what is a man is like another thing, or what is gender? What does it mean when you say I am a man or I am a woman? What is it that you are saying? Right. So that is potentially an ontological question. It is the study of being. Okay. All right. So topic critiques. The one in the packet is capitalism. I think that these are some other ones. So governmentality, I think will not be popular because it's never popular anymore. But it is the idea of how we think about the law and legal structures and governance and what is the role of the law in affecting and influencing our lives. Coercion. So the protection of intellectual property potentially trades off with individual rights and causes governments to be large. Another word for this is like libertarianism. Afro-pessimism and settler colonialism are two structural criticisms that are about fundamentally the ethics of the legal system that protects property in the first place and what constitutes property and what constitutes ownership. One of the first examples that was given was slavery, and so for a long time in the United States, the slaves were property. And how does that affect the notions of property that exist today? Same with colonialism and indigeneity as property, or indigenous people as property to be moved around and manipulated as well. All right, we have 15 minutes left, right? Okay.
You can always.
Yeah, I mean, well, so, all right, I will, there are a couple of things I wanted to do. What is flood one? It doesn't matter. So, this we probably don't have time for. I just wanted to show you what like a critique file looks like, and this is just one scanning for viruses. Just give it a second. So this is a K that is largely set up to be gone for as a framework critique, and it was obviously it's for the last topic, and so this is kind of what the structure of a file for a critique might look like. And so you've got kind of a bunch of different thesis arguments in the 1NC for 1NC groups. And an alternative, just kind of what we talked about. And the way that you would structure 1NC is you would figure out which one of these match up with the 1AC that you're trying to debate. So you might want to have a topic link. So like this was a topic link, right? And then links to various advantages. And then you would have, a prepared set of framework arguments and stuff for the alternative. We didn't talk about permutations, but that's okay. And then you might want to have some ideas about what your link arguments will be about with more cards. And then you might want to have answers to common things that opponents have said against you throughout the year. So if you debate an opponent, you're going for a critique, they read this card against you, you might want to have some answers to those cards and write them out beforehand to be as prepared as possible. This stuff I don't like as much, but through here I think it's pretty well organized. So critique file organization, very similar to any file that you would ever do. Yeah, any questions about how to organize a file? Yeah.
Do you have any, can I just see the block,
I mean, what do you mean see the blocks?
I just want to see how it's organized,
Is there a particular one you want to see?
Well, there was another like gaslighting now, but is that
Well,
it said the word gaslighting in one of the blocks. I was like, oh, what is that?
Oh, this? Yeah, yeah, I mean, a lot of it is like, you know, you want cards and analytics just like anything else. There's no one way to extend a critique. Some people read many, many cards. Some people read very few cards. It's just kind of about like what works best for you.
What's the 2-hour stuff?
2-hour stuff?
Yeah,
2-hour stuff is just like stuff that is, you know you're going to say in the 2-hour. So there'll be a lot of stuff like this, where there'll be quotes to make stuff more specific. But 2-hour blocks can help you with organization and structure. You never want to read them straight down because your arguments will never be particularly compelling because they won't be about the debate. But writing out 2-hour stuff in advance can be really, really helpful for just thinking about the structure and organization of your speech. So I would encourage 2-hour block writing not as I'm writing out my 2-hour beforehand word for word, but instead I'm like making a template for what should be said in my speech generally, and then do your 2-hour off your flow based on that general template. Does that make sense? So that's what the 2-hour stuff is for.
Just a little bit, like not really this, but you mentioned earlier. What was the movie called?
Huh?
The movie.
The movie?
Yeah.
Dr. Strange.
Yeah.
Doctor what?
Dr. Strangelove.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's the movie. It's it was directed by this person, who you may have heard of. He's directed like a couple of movies that people have tended to like. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah. Well, we didn't really get to the Cap K, but that's okay. That's fine. I'm sure that your labs will individually go over the Cap K, and you'll learn a ton from that. If you're interested in a bunch of slides for the Cap K, I can send the slides out for this, even though we don't really have time to go through it. But yeah, it's just the Cap K is just a bunch of math. That's all it is really. Okay. Well, thanks for hanging out for the past 2 hours. If you have more questions, I'm sure your lab leaders will have an incredible time talking to you more about critiques.